So, good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Stiasny. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor International and also Chief Executive of what used to be called International Programmes, the programmes of the University of London and the University of London worldwide. I'm also losing my voice, so forgive me if I start croaking at you. It's the plane trees around here. This year, University of London is celebrating 150 years since we first welcomed women into the university. In 1868, 9 women were admitted into the University of London to take special examinations. It was another 10 years before they were permitted to take the same examinations as men. But let's not dwell on that. At least in 1868, it started. And in fact, the University of London was the first university to admit women to university-level education. There are lots of stories around those 9 women and what it was like for them taking those special examinations. Maybe I'll tell you the stories later. But to celebrate this, and we're very proud of it, we have a whole year of celebratory events under the Leading Women title campaign. And there are, at the back, 2 globes, right on the very back row, 2 globes, one with these badges, Leading Women badges, and one with leaflets or little pamphlets about the Leading Women activities. There is also a Leading Women website on our website, or Leading Women section on our website, with 150 women from over the whole of the 150 years. Some past, some present, some dead, some live, 150 women. And it would be worth just dialing into that, checking into that, and having a look at some of the people who are featured there. I'll come back to that in a moment. We'll hear from our speakers this evening, where we're having an evening discussing the theme of education for women through the lens of law and human rights. And we'll hear from our speakers how women's lives are shaped and changed by an access to education and about the work they do in this area, whether that is academic work, as researchers and teachers, or advocacy work to influence the government and our society as a whole. The University of London itself is committed to educating women worldwide and continues to educate women all over the world through our distance and flexible learning programs. Postgraduate study through distance or blended learning is available in both law and human rights, and hopefully our speakers will shine some light on why these kinds of education are so important. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to our speakers, and then I'm going to invite them each in turn to speak for a short while, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Adams, who is an early career researcher with the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies at the University of London. Rachel's background is in human rights, having led the civil and political rights research portfolio at the South African Human Rights Commission from 2014 to 16. Rachel maintains a particular focus on women's rights and critical approaches to human rights and global governance. Next to her in the middle is Professor Lisa Webley, and Lisa is Chair in Legal Education and Research at the University of Birmingham. Professor Lisa Webley's research concerns the regulation, education, and ethicality and professionalism of the legal profession and broader access to justice and rule of law concerns. Lisa is General Editor of Legal Ethics and also co-director of the Legal Education Research Network. She holds visiting professorships at the Sir Zelman Cowen Centre at Victoria University, Australia, and at the University of Portsmouth. Lisa holds a senior research fellowship at IALS, the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, University of London, and is an external examiner on the University of London's LLM. And right next to me is Becca Bunce. Becca is an eminent human rights campaigner and currently is the co-director I See Change, a volunteer-led campaign calling on the UK government to ratify the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. And we're excited to announce, and it's hot off the presses, that Becca has this week accepted to become one of our 150 leading women. We're highlighting these 150 women, as I said, associated with the University of London to mark the 150 years since our foot in the door moment for women in higher education. Coming back to Becca. Becca is an alumna of the MA Human Rights from the University of London, which is a course available both on campus in London and through distance learning. Here, she developed her interest in issue framing, the intersection of rights and participation in democracy. Becca was cited as an inspiration by President Obama for her work on violence against women and disabled people's rights. So let me turn to them now and invite each of them in turn to speak to us. First of all, Rachel.
Well, thank you very much to the organisers and to our chair for introducing us. I'm very excited to be here and to be part of the University of London's celebration on 150 years of women in education. So, I thought I would begin today's talk on women's rights and the impact of women's education in 19th century Iran, or what was then Persia. The man pictured here is named Abdul-Baha, and he was one of the leading fathers of the Baha'i faith. But what was so interesting about this man in his contribution to Baha'i doctrine was his teachings on women, and particularly women's education. Here we have two of his key points. First, that women's education is of greater importance than men's. And second, that not until the equality of opportunity in education for the two sexes is established will the foundations of war be removed. Now, we must bear in mind that Abdul-Baha's teachings were arising at a time when questions around women's education, and specifically further and higher education, were only beginning to be considered on the global stage. Indeed, as our chairperson told us, it was around this time that the University of London opened up their degree programme to women in 1878 as the first higher education institution to do so. But despite these advancements in the UK and elsewhere, at that time there was little ideological thinking connecting the education of women with the impact it would have on society as a whole, which is why Abdul-Baha's teachings were so extraordinary for their time. Indeed, it was only in 2006 that Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the United Nations, famously stated that women's empowerment is the most important policy for preventing conflict and achieving reconciliation after a conflict is ended, well over 100 years after Abdul-Baha preached of gender equality as the foundation of peace. Moreover, the language of equality of opportunities, substantive equality, and not just formal equality in the form of laws, has become embedded only fairly recently within the international human rights canon. The societal benefits of educating women are now, of course, well announced. It has been found that women produce a higher return than men on the resources they invest in education, including by reinvesting a higher percentage of their income into family and household well-being. It's been found that educating women increases a country's GDP. It increases the equitability of the distribution of wealth, thereby reducing inequality writ large. It increases the likelihood of democratic governance. It helps control population growth and reduce child mortality rates, as well as gender bias in child mortality. And it has been quoted that progress in women's education resulted in a 43% reduction in world hunger in the last quarter of the 20th century. And of course, it leads more directly to the empowerment of the next generation. Yet, despite all of this, the human right of access to education for women has only a fairly recent history, which we'll briefly look into. The international human rights law, as we know it now, largely came into effect following the Second World War and the global commitment to preventing humanitarian crises of this nature again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was the first document to set out an international Bill of Rights. The drafting committee for the UDHR was famously chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt as the previous First Lady of the United States, a fact that has been much quoted in women's human rights history. However, 3 other, much lesser known women also made significant contributions to the final text of the UDHR through their role in the drafting committee. And those are the 3 women we see here. So the first is Hansa Mehta from India, who was instrumental in replacing the phrase "all men are born free and equal" in Article 1 of the UDHR to what was finally "all human beings are born free and equal," although the article goes on to read that all should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Second, Minerva Bernardino, who's on the top, of the Dominican Republic, who pushed to include the phrase equality of men and women in the UDHR's preamble. And third was Begum Shiasta Ikramullah of Pakistan, who advocated for the inclusion of Article 16, which sets out equal rights for men and women within marriage. Now, the inclusion of this specific right is of particular importance for the development of the conceptualization of human rights and women's rights. So traditionally, human rights were conceived of as obligations incumbent upon the state to respect or realise or promote. However, many violations of women's rights, as we know, occur at the hands of a third party or within the private home. Thus, in order to fully address discrimination against women in all its forms, the human rights framework had to extend its reach to protect against human rights violations that may occur within the private sphere. So Article 16 of the UDHR and equal marriage rights were where this started. Later, in 1963, the then Commission on the Status of Women within the UN began drafting a specific Bill of Rights which was to become the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. CEDAW was eventually adopted by the General Assembly in 1979. So Article 10 of CEDAW, which we see here, sets out the fullest expression of women's rights of access to education in international human rights law. So I'm going to highlight 2 of these sub-rights listed here, as we're going to come back to those 2 rights later. So first is C, point C, state parties shall take measures to eliminate the stereotyped concept of the roles of men and women at all levels and in all forms of education by encouraging co-education and other types of education which will help to achieve this aim, and in particular by the revision of textbooks and school programs and the adaptation of teaching materials. And F, state parties shall take measures to reduce female student dropout rates and the organisation of programmes for girls and women who have left school prematurely. So in terms of this latter point, in South Africa, where I have spent the last 10 years working on issues of human rights, it is estimated that about 26% of girls leave school before the age of 17 because of factors such as pregnancy, a lack of information about re-enrolment in school after giving birth, a lack of sanitary products and sanitation facilities generally, rape and sexual harassment by both teachers and fellow learners, poverty, family household commitments, and HIV/AIDS. And the figure for girls dropping out of school is much higher than it is for boys. Just under 20 years after CEDAW came into effect, the African Union commissioned the drafting of a regional treaty on women's rights. After an 8-year-long drafting process, the Protocol on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa was finally adopted and came into force in 2005. And this is a map of the ratification of this treaty as it currently stands. So it's pretty widely ratified across sub-Saharan Africa. So known as the Maputo Protocol, as it was first adopted by the African Union in Maputo, Mozambique, this treaty sets out a series of rights specific to the needs and issues facing women within the African region. Importantly, it is widely accepted as the most progressive international agreement on women's rights, noting that there is no equivalent women's rights instrument within the European or American regional human rights systems. And I think Becca will talk later a little bit about the Istanbul Convention against violence against women, but that's not a fully encompassing treaty which encompasses all of women's rights. So in particular, the Maputo Protocol provides for a series of socio-economic rights for all women, and CEDAW only provides for these rights for rural women. So these rights would include housing, water, and food. In addition, the Maputo Protocol calls on states to reduce military spending in favour of developing programmes for the advancement and empowerment of women. Another of the reasons that the Maputo Protocol is so highly regarded is for its understanding of two key rights concepts. First is the interdependence of rights. So broadly, the fact that rights are not just enjoyed or realised autonomously, and where one right is violated, another can also be impacted. So as an example, the protocol notes that harmful practices, this would include something like female genital mutilation, negatively impacts a girl's enjoyment of other rights such as education, health, and dignity. And the second key concept, which I think Becca might speak more to later, that the Maputo Protocol demonstrates an awareness of is the intersectionality of discrimination that particular women may experience. That is, that certain women can simultaneously experience discrimination on a number of different levels, a point that Kimberly Crenshaw articulated in the 1970s with respect to how black women experience heightened levels of discrimination as compared to white women, as they experience discrimination both on the basis of race and gender. In recognition of this, the protocol sets out certain rights for women who are rendered vulnerable within society, such as women living in poverty, women living with HIV/AIDS, or widows. It notes that such women, because they experience multiple forms of discrimination, and not just discrimination on the basis of gender, require further protection from abuse and rights violations. Yet despite the formal advancements made in the establishment of international codes of women's rights, women continue to face numerous barriers, both in realising their rights to education and within the labour market, as I'm sure we'll discuss further tonight. A number of years ago, I had the pleasure of teaching women's rights to a group of women from various African countries who had received scholarships to undertake doctoral and postdoctoral studies at the world's top universities in STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. And we had an extended discussion about the discrimination they had or may potentially face in undertaking such work. And interestingly, most of them experienced little stigma from their home communities, including when their studies involved taking time away from their children and family responsibilities, but instead spoke about the discrimination they faced as women within this male-dominated field. Some of the concerns raised included that their male counterparts received greater encouragement and career advice from senior colleagues to pursue careers in technology and science. They spoke more seriously, too, about bullying, sexual violence, and sexual harassment experienced by women in higher education institutions around the world, and how the hierarchical nature of academia often mimics gender prejudices. This translates into the wage gap between men and women that exists predominantly both within academia and within the science and technology fields. Indeed, despite the increase of women in education, this has largely not been matched by an increase of women in the labour market. This is particularly evident in the science and technology sector, where 90% of executive positions are occupied by men. And in this male-dominated tech world, in whose hands is held the future of our society, what we are ending up with is this. So these are just a few examples of artificial intelligence programmed assistants or chatbots, as well as Sophia, who is the Hanson Robotics' latest social humanoid robot, and Alicia Vikander as Ava in Andrew Garland's Ex Machina. These robots, or AI assistants, are designed to take orders and help you with everyday tasks and inquiries. They're personalised to suit your needs, artificial handmaids, if you will. They appear, as you can see, to have something in common. They appear to be gendered and gendered female, a point which a colleague of mine, Dr. Nora Nee-Lidzon, drew my attention to, and which now forms part of a broader research inquiry into the ethics of artificial intelligence, which we are both working on. Just by way of a side point, the name Siri, so that's the Apple AI assistant, is a Nordic name meaning a beautiful woman who leads you to victory. So having begun this presentation in 19th century Iran, we will end instead in the imagined future of Silicon Valley, a future which is looking decisively gendered. From the tech-topic future of Silicon Valley to Margaret Atwood's dystopic future of New England, both visions of a future America feature handmaids of one kind or another. This is an illustration by Anna and Elena Balbuso for the cover of the reissue of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which of course has been popularised through the TV series, and the illustrators sought here to capture the industrial, militarised, subservient, uniform and yet eroticised depiction of women in the novel, a depiction which appears uncanny put alongside the gender developments in artificial intelligence assistance I've just spoken of. Yet there is another point that I've been trying to make here today, and that is to caution against defaulting to the West and the global North as beacons of global progress in terms of having all the answers to gender equality, women's empowerment and women's education. Nor can we assume that the technological advances that are characterising the progress of global society and that emanate particularly out of the West are neutral and free of gender bias. Indeed, as some of the history I've covered here today shows us, the teachings of the Baha'i faith in 19th century Iran, the untold history of the role of Hansa Mehta of India, of Minerva Bernardino of the Dominican Republic, and Begum Shiasta Ikramullah of Pakistan in the drafting of the UDHR, and the progressive human rights instruments of the African Union, all point instead to the contributions of the global South to our present understandings of and commitments to gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And now, Lisa, please.
Thank you very much. Let me just get this down to a level where you can hear me. Today, I'm going to talk about women and education and women in law. My background is as a lawyer and a legal educator. And so I thought I'd start off with the history of the role that education has played in women being able to become lawyers, first and foremost. Because without higher education access, it would not have been possible for women to advance into the legal profession. Then I'm going to move on to the place of women in the legal profession now, and I'm going to give you some figures about the proportions of women at different levels of their professional trajectory. And we can see how far women have come, but also how far we have to go before we end up with true equality of opportunity for women as lawyers. And I'm going to briefly touch upon some of the challenges that remain for women in the legal profession. That's an area of research that I undertake, not just in the context of women, in the context of other diversity characteristics as well, but for today's purposes, I'm going to focus on that. So given that we're here, given we're at the University of London, I'd start off with a bit of history which demonstrates just how far in advance the University of London was in terms of access to education for women. So the first female higher education college, Bedford College, which became part of the University of London, was established in the mid-1800s. It was the very first one. And they gave the opportunity for women to study the University of London examinations, as we've already heard, in 1878. Without that, it would not have been possible for women to gain access to the professions. UCL allowed women to participate in some evening classes in the 1860s, again a first, and they opened a women's hall of residence in 1882, an opportunity for women to go away to study. It had been open to men for centuries, but not for women. And in 1878, UCL became the first university in England to allow women to enrol in law degrees. Up until then, it really wasn't possible for women to study for a law degree. 1888 was the date when the first woman actually graduated with a law degree. So, women have been in law for 150 years, but they couldn't become lawyers. They couldn't become lawyers because of provisions in legislation which indicated that in order to become a professional, you had to be classed as a legal person, and women weren't. So it wasn't until 1919 that it was possible for women to join a host of professions, including the legal profession. Now, 1919 for some people, I'm sure in the room, seems a long time ago. For some of us, it feels a little bit more recent. It means that when my grandmothers were both born, not only could they not become a member of the legal profession, they also couldn't vote. And women were only able to vote at the same time as they could be admitted to the legal profession. And so in 1919, after the removal of the bar to women becoming professionals, there was a whole race on the part of the women who'd been allowed access to higher education some 50 years earlier to become members of the professions. And so we've got a whole set of firsts up on the screen there. We've got Ada Summers, who became the first Justice of the Peace straight away, as soon as it was possible. Women could join juries from 1920. They couldn't do that before then because they weren't legal persons. The first female barrister was called to the bar 1920. Been educated previously, couldn't join, however, because it wasn't open to women. And the first female solicitor was admitted in 1922. A group of women who had previously studied law had sought admission prior to that and had been refused on the basis that a woman could not, by definition, become a member of a profession. And so we saw a massive leap forward in the 1920s of women joining all aspects of the legal profession, from solicitors to barristers, to becoming magistrates, to being in juries. Women had been excluded from the professions, and all of a sudden, having said that, whilst women were admitted, that did not necessarily mean that they were going to rise up through the ranks at speed. And it took some time before we saw women in positions of power at the senior levels of the legal profession. Now, one of the things that is often said to those women like me who from time to time have been known to complain that the speed of progress is not as great as it should be is, it'll take time. It will take time for women to trickle up through the ranks. It's bound to take time to get a mass of women from a standing start up to the senior levels. And there is some evidence for that here. We saw the first woman to be given senior status at the bar. It's now called Queen's Counsel. At the time there was a king, so it was King's Counsel. First barrister, 1920. The first King's Counsel, 1949. 20 years. Two were admitted at the same time. The first female judge, 1956. Until then, no women were full judges. They could be magistrates, but not judges. Criminal cases in the Old Bailey within my lifetime, 1972. First judge trying criminal cases. And the High Court, 1974. So it was only in the 1970s that we started to see women getting into senior-ish judicial positions. And it will be, I think, within the lifetime of everybody in the room, that we saw the first woman be appointed to the most senior court in the UK, what was called the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court, Baroness Hale. She was the first and has recently been joined by a second female judge in the Supreme Court. So if trickle up as a theory were likely to work, we would have expected to see more women up at the higher levels of seniority well before then. Women were being admitted to the profession in 1920, and yet the first woman at the top of the court hierarchy was in 2004. 84 years on. So, some figures then about women in the two main branches of the legal profession now. So, what do those figures tell us? Well, what it tells us is that 65% of all people doing undergraduate law degrees in England and Wales, or graduate diplomas, conversion courses after doing a different undergraduate degree, are women. 65% of law graduates are female. 35% are BAME, are from a minority ethnic group. So we've got tremendous diversity within our undergraduate law populations. 2/3 of those studying law are female. And we see that following completion of their legal studies at university, when they go on to train to be either a solicitor or a barrister, which is the next stage for those who want to be in the practicing profession, the mainstream practicing profession, women carry on to the legal practice course, the next level up, in equal proportions. So 65% of those people enrolling on the vocational stage are women. 64, 65 varies year on year. But we see a drop when it comes to going to the bar instead. You make a choice. You either go down the solicitor route for a year to do the training or the bar for a year. We're down to 52% right after the undergraduate law degree when it comes to the bar. Many women report they don't think they're likely to have such good job prospects at the bar, therefore they won't risk that route. They will try the route that looks more likely to be an effective one for them. Going on to the next level up, which is the period of work-based learning following completion of all the exams, the training contract for solicitors and the pupillage for barristers, you see the proportions remain roughly the same. So as the earlier stage, we've got women going in. Once they've made a decision to commit to the profession, they're getting jobs, they're getting into the profession, so we don't have an issue there. But then you start to see a drop-off. So on completion of the training contract, we're down to 59% of that group of women. That's the point when they finish their training and they then sign up for a full career as a newly qualified solicitor. 51%, the equivalent as a barrister. And then you notice the real drop, and that's the senior status level. So if you are a woman solicitor and you're thinking about your career options, you'll note that between 29%, that's large law firms, and 33% in small law firms, of people who are partners who own the legal firm are women. 65% of law graduates are women, 29 to 33% of partners are women. And you'll see in the context of QCs, the very senior status of barrister, 15% of them are women. 27% roughly is the number that are being made QCs each year now, because we had a very, very low historic number of female QCs, so the population is somewhat diluted. But just over a quarter of QC appointments each year are currently female. And the judiciary are drawn usually from the QC group. Some senior solicitors will go into the judiciary as well, nonetheless. And you'll see that 35% of all barristers are female and 48% of all solicitors are female. And yet at the senior levels, you haven't got the same diversity as at the bottom. So what does that lead us to conclude? Well, we've known for an awfully long time that there is what's known as a leaky pipeline problem. It's like a pipe that's got a little hole in it. And you find that women fall through it on a regular basis. So we know that at points where there are decisions to be made or opportunities to be taken, women on the whole are less likely to take the opportunity or to be given the opportunity or to decide to stay than are men. We know that women are much more likely to leave the legal profession than are their male counterparts. We know from the research that we've done that notions of merit, what is excellence, are not neutral. They're not neutral. It's very difficult to be able to assess whether somebody is excellent at being a professional. It's very hard to do, because you're not just excellent at one thing, there are lots and lots of different things that make up excellent performance. And we have to use proxies. We have to use measures that aren't really very sophisticated to try to get to the quality we are attempting to assess. The challenge is that those measures aren't objective, and it's very difficult for us to weigh all of those different measures against each other and say, this is what makes an excellent lawyer, this person's performing better than this person, we will pay this one more and this one less, we will promote this one, we won't promote this one. It's not just the case for the legal profession, it's all walks of life. Assessment is difficult. You'll know that, those of you who've been through assessment processes yourself, and you get very irritated by the assessment criteria and say, this doesn't truly show what I'm capable of doing. It's the same whether it's exams, whether it's presentations, whether it's your day-to-day working life, what you're like as a partner to somebody, a girlfriend, a boyfriend. It's all difficult to get at. How do we know if somebody's doing well or doing badly? We have to make judgments. And what we also know is that the more homogenous, the more similar the decision-making group is in reaching those assessments, the more likely those assessments are to be prey to bias. Because people who are similar tend to think similarly. It's not necessarily a question of people saying, we want women to do less well than men. We want people from dominant groups to do better than those from minority groups. It's more about who is making the decisions and how much diversity is there in the decision-making cohort. The more diversity, likely the more disagreement. And in this context, disagreement is good. Because if you disagree, you have to justify. And if you have to justify, you have to slow down your thinking. And if you have to slow down your thinking and look for evidence, you are more likely to be able to assess someone fairly rather than on the basis of stereotype and hunch. So we know that decision-making processes around hiring, promotion, pay review require slower thinking and debate, not quick proxies to be used. And often dominant groups will benefit from the quick, minority groups will not. And of course we also know about the wider structural issues which make it very difficult for some women, not just women, but some women to be able to participate in the workplace in the same way as their male counterparts. And so, taken together, I think what we can say is that women have made huge progress over the last 150 years. We've gained access to higher education. We've gained access to career opportunities in professions. By being members of the legal profession, we've been able to both embody the rights of women to participate and to champion them too. But we also need to keep in mind there is more work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And can I now invite Becca to speak to us?
I'm going to remain sat down. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay. So first of all, say thank you very much to the University of London for inviting me along today. It's actually a little bit strange coming back into this building because I did my master's here in human rights between 2012 and 2014. And walking back in and being asked to speak on a stage like this feels remarkable, but it's also very much in part due to the course that I did. And there's a bit of a cliche here of the title of this event was about transforming lives. And the Masters came at a point in my life which was pretty pivotal for me, and it also changed not only my understanding in terms of my technical understanding, but my understanding of what I could do and what I could take out into the world. So a little bit of what I'm going to go through. As campaigning, we're taught to talk a little bit about the story of self. We're going to start with a little bit of my own personal experience of education. I'm then going to briefly go on to how this particular course has worked in the wider world. And then there's a little bit about what is it about opening up access? Because thinking about those 9 women who came along 150 years ago, what it must have felt like to have been one of those 9. And what it's like to be any woman who applies and puts herself out there and says, I'm going to go for this and I'm going to put myself forward. That is so tough. And it still is tough. It is still a tough environment. And it's something that I think we need to acknowledge, and that we need to think about how that works as well when we've got other intersections, whether it's race, disability, migration status, trans status. There are a multitude of factors that can affect our experiences of our lives. Really briefly, there are 2 logos up there. One is I See Change, which is the campaign which I'll talk a little bit about later. The second one is where I actually do my paid job, and have kindly let me come along this evening, and that's Involve, who are an organisation that specialise in public participation, so putting people at the heart of decision making. So about access and education. I can still remember the joy of being admitted to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies because it came at a point in my life that wasn't particularly easy. I was in and out of hospital. In fact, I'd had 17 admissions that year. I'd been in intensive care and I'd been in high dependency units. I was facing what I thought was a very unknown future. I've been disabled my whole life. My understanding and my ability to own being disabled has taken a long time, and being disabled alongside being a woman has taken even longer. One of the things that brought me here was a slightly different approach. So when I came along and I asked questions about disability, they were answered in a way that didn't centre me as a problem, my body as a problem. It was instead, what can we do as a community to support and to help? And I decided, like I always do, to throw myself at something. So I said, oh, I can do the full-time course. I can push myself through. And it became very clear very quickly that at that point, a full-time course wasn't right for me. And it was the flexibility to drop down to part-time education, the fact that the lecturers still checked in with me, that they adjusted formats, and that even when I was in hospital, people dropped me emails just to check how I was doing, that students came in with books, or also with a load of word like games and apps and stuff like that. Okay, so there was some stuff that wasn't university work, but critically there was a community there. And I think we can undervalue that as women, in fact, as all people, we need our communities, we need our support to be able to move forward. And for me, that was something that I found here. But there's wider structures as well. One of the reasons that I could come here is that I got a scholarship. And that allowed me to be able to afford to take on this course. I also, at the time, was on disability benefits, and I was allowed to study as well as be on disability benefits. Now, these might sound like small things, but as someone who can't take a part-time job normally alongside what I'm doing, actually, these were critical lifelines that allowed me to have access to education that otherwise would have been denied to me, and is denied to so many people. And one of the big things that came out of the course was that, obviously, I learned about campaigning, I learned about influencing, I learned about structures of change. And from this, I had a theoretical framework, first principles that I could go back to, and that I could see how I could create change. As part of that, whilst I was on the course, I was involved in a project at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which was creating a patient passport to help people that go into A&E who can't speak at the time. So I have severe asthma, and that means that if I have an asthma attack, you can't talk, and yet they ask you the same set of questions, or they used to, about 6 times in your journey between ambulance through to ward. And if you can't answer them, that's a pretty frustrating status to be in. And that's one of the joys of this, was that I was able to apply human rights principles as someone who was a patient involved in a project, and be seen as an equal to the nurses and doctors and the people from the London Ambulance Service who all got involved to design this passport, which has gone on to be used really successfully and has had incredible success in not only reducing the time that it takes to treat, but also the severity of attacks. The other thing that I got out of being here was the networks, and it was through the networks I heard of something called Campaign Bootcamp, and that's how I ended up doing I See Change. So 3.5 years ago, I was sat on some steps outside of a building with a group of women, and we had a conversation about just how difficult it was being a woman, how difficult it was being a woman who was trying to influence and campaign. And this was at this course, and I'd heard about it through the university. We went away and we all kept in contact. We talked about feminism, and to be honest, we were just looking to set up a book club. And then one day, over Facebook chat of all things, a friend messaged me and said, "Hey, so do you want to do a change.org petition on the Istanbul Convention?" And that spiralled into something that I don't quite know how we got here. So, the Istanbul Convention, full name, Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. They made it really pithy, which makes it really simple to campaign on. We're talking about international law, so that's about signing and ratification, and how do you differentiate between the two? It sounds like a dry subject, yet it is an incredible law that sees a whole system approach to ending violence against women. It's along a pathway that starts with preventing violence, moves through to protecting those who are experiencing violence, prosecuting those that are perpetrating the violence, and monitoring it. And as someone who's a bit of a human rights geek, monitoring is really important. When it comes to this prevent, protect, prosecute, and monitor approach, this is across a series of things: FGM, so-called honour-based violence, sexual assault and rape, domestic violence, stalking. This is critical because often what we see, particularly in the women's sector, is that issues are pitted against each other for money. They're pitted against each other for time, attention, and importance, rather than responded to in the whole approach. And again, that could still sound quite dry to you, but as a group of women coming together, the three of us who co-founded all had particular experiences of the system at different levels, working, volunteering, and we realised that this was a way of looking at it differently that brought people together rather than pitting different organisations against each other. And the key thing about this is that we came in at a point when women's organisations were saying you need to ratify the Istanbul Convention to the government over and over and again. They'd just been submitting to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. There were hundreds of responses saying this, and the government was giving the same line. It wasn't that they weren't going to do it, it's just that it was in progress. But they'd been using the same line for 3 years, so we thought it might be time to give them a nudge. I think one of my favourite things when we started the campaign was someone said to us, "This law, like most women, is overambitious." And at that point, we knew that we were locked in, because it's not overambitious to ask for decent infrastructure for women that ensures that they can live lives free from violence. So what happened? It started with a change.org petition. So up in the corner there is a little tweet that we regularly put out reminding people to sign the petition copy. We then moved on to creating a coalition of over 50 women's organisations and human rights organisations. And through them, we worked together to work out how we could amplify their voices and make sure that their messages were being heard across all the different issues, whether it was housing, whether it was about specialist services, FGM services that were being closed. And then we got invited into Parliament for a roundtable. And this is where it all gets a little bit bizarre and a little bit quick, because 6 months later we got offered a private member's bill. So that's a backbench bill. It's not one that's been put forward by the government. And it requires something pretty special, which is 100 MPs to show up on 2 Fridays to vote. Fridays are traditionally their constituency day. We got the Friday before Christmas. So we had them all out, Christmas card competitions, lots of nativity plays, etc., etc. So we knew we had a challenge. But we also knew that we had an opportunity. We had an opportunity to hold the government to account. So the private member's bill that we took through and we were successful with was a law that created an accountability mechanism, which means every single year in November, the government has to report on its progress towards ratification on the Istanbul Convention against each of the measures. This was not a simple thing to do, necessarily, but I had the backing of an education. So one of the best things was that I had read, as part of my degree, a load of evaluation forms from different organisations on using private members' bills for campaigning. And that meant that I was going into it with an understanding of how you could do something like this. We'd also talked about creative campaigning. So in actually the petition copy, you can see there's a giant 4-foot card. We delivered that to the Home Office just to remind them that it was, I think that was 5 years since they had signed and not ratified the Istanbul Convention. We've also turned up with motivational mixtapes for Theresa May and various other bits. As we went through, we realised that we were capturing attention, and there were little moments where we had to rely on, and all of us actually, I think that, well, not all of us, the majority of us were from the University of London actually, and had done human rights education from across the University of London's many schools. And we had to rely on the fact that we had this grounding, because I must admit, if being thrown into this with a private members bill without it, I'm not quite sure how we would have done it. What was striking for me was that we did this as a grassroots organisation with £2,000. This is a very, very small pot of money. It was grassroots volunteers. We had people going out around the country speaking, talking to their MPs, changing their minds over Twitter, changing their minds by doing creative activities and delivering these beautiful paper dolls dreams to their local MP. And what was striking for me was that for each one of them, we were bringing more people in and more women, and a diverse group of women and men who were interested in the campaign. However, there was also something that was in the back of my mind, and it was this. As I went into campaigning, the more that we were successful, the more that we did well, and we got things, particularly when we got the bill through, more people asked the question, how are you leading? How is this happening? Is it legitimate the way that these women are engaging? There were questions about the representation in terms of leadership of, so how can a disabled person do this campaign, do what you're doing? How can people from different backgrounds be coming together like this? And it led to me going back to my human rights papers and having a good think. And it brought me back to the principle of access. Access is something that if you can get into a room and you don't have to think about it, then structurally it's been built in for you. If you've walked in and you've not considered, you've just sat down, that room was made for you. You haven't thought about, what am I going to wear today? Or is there a flight of stairs? Or will people look at me as the only person who represents X in a room? And the more that I thought about this, the more I thought, I need to start addressing this as well. And it became an interesting dynamic, because in some ways I was scared of speaking up. As a disabled woman, I'm more likely to lose my job. As a disabled woman, I'm actually less likely to even have a job. And yet I knew that if I didn't speak, I'm denying that opportunity to other people to come in. So the first one was I was sent a provocation title to write an article for Akivo, who are a charity sector body for leaders. And they sent me one about how can we move beyond collectivism to harness technology. And I fumed, because one of the things that has struck me is that we've used, so collectivism, the idea of using technology, online petition forums, that this is something it's not legitimate engagement. What happens when we delegitimize people and the way that they're engaging if we're not offering them another way to participate? That opened up lots of questions for me. And one of the big things is actually going back to Rachel's point about technology and about who's creating it, is that actually we could be making our technologies a little bit more creative. We could be making Eventbrite easier so that it's able to list whether you can have children coming along to an event, or whether there's going to be some place, there's going to be a creche there, or whether there's going to be disabled access. And what does that mean by disabled access? Like, does that mean that it's step-free? Does it mean that there's going to be a sign interpreter there? We could be doing more if it wasn't for the fact that the people that are probably making these decisions look the same. So going back to Lisa's point, and thank you very much, both of you, for setting me up nicely on this. It also struck me that the way that we talk about access is almost like something that someone's giving us and we should be grateful for. And I spend a lot of time saying thank you and being grateful for people changing a room for me so that I can get into it, changing a space. I think many women have. I think that's a general theme, that when we go into spaces, we often have to then go in and try and change them and make them better for the next person that comes through. And the more that I thought about access, and I thought about it in terms of feminism, I thought, well, each campaign that I know about feminism has in part been about access. It's about changing a space to allow someone else to come through. And I think it's striking that when we think about the first women that came through, it's who was next. When we think about who got the vote, so 100 years of that, it wasn't all women. So we've got to keep thinking who hasn't got it. So what some people might not know here is that disabled women in the UK can't vote in secret in many locations. A basic tenet of democracy is a problem across this country. And yet it's a hidden one, because we don't necessarily get to see those people and hear them speak and hear that this is a problem, because they're not able to get in the room anyway to let people know. So the more that I thought about this, and the more that I was thinking about this wider systems process of campaigning, it brought me to intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw. It brought me to the idea of how do we build spaces that are better? And a big question to start with is who's in the room? And if you look around and say, who's in this room? And then the next question is, who should be in this room? And I hope that the answer should always be about diversity, because we know that that challenge is critical for making good decisions. Then the next question has to be, what do we need to do so they can be in the room? And also, does it need to be our room that they're in, or can we go to their room? Because there are people building brilliant spaces on the margins, and we can learn a lot from those spaces, whether it's about global north versus global south, and that actually we don't have all the answers in the West, whether it's about the spaces that we want to create in our own communities. Each space that often what we try to do is ask people to come to us, and there's a thing about how can we go to other people and how can we learn? And one of the things that I've found brilliant about having a human rights education is that it's given me a framework that's made me think wider than just my issue and my space. It's okay, if I can get in the room now, I'll be honest, an Obama name drop did an awful lot of good for me being able to get into some spaces. But it's no good if I can get in there and no one else can. It's no good if I go through and I slam the door in someone else's face. You've got to keep that door open. It's just being a door wedge most of the time. You've got to fill the room with as many different people as possible. So there are many challenges that still face us. And one of the reasons I went to Involve is because of the way that they look at challenges like this, the fact that they look at how we can look at participation, how we can look at lived experience, and how we can look at representative samples and bring different ways together of seeing how we can change decision making. It's also been a challenge. One of the things I was thinking about as I come to the end was about the challenges of education and what's going forward. Because those 9 women got in, and then more, but who's still not here? So is it about disabled women and access? Is it about, there's been fantastic menstrual rights campaigns recently, so thinking about period poverty, thinking about, can you access basic period supplies? And are they ones that you actually want to use? Migration status is a key one. Childcare, trans rights and bathrooms. There are so many different issues that can bar us from getting into the room. And I think a critical challenge for us going forward is going to be, how do we keep asking who should be in this room? What are we doing to make sure that they are in the room? And also, can we go to their room sometime? So thank you very much for the time, and looking forward to see how this develops. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becca. So thank you to all our speakers. And now it's an opportunity for you to ask questions and engage with them in dialogue. Can you, if you are asking a question, indicate whether you're asking it of one of the specific speakers, one speaker specifically, or more generally? And there is a microphone at the back. Rianne is going to bring the microphone around. So if you indicate you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up, and it would be nice if you introduced yourself as you ask the questions. So over to you now.
Hi, my name's Ruth Buckingham. I work for the University of London, and I'd like to ask Professor Webley, given that you are talking about access to the legal profession and the reasons why women don't move up the scale, I suppose my question is, what are you going to do now? What is the profession going to do to allow women to move up to the higher positions?
Thank you. Well, a tremendous amount of time and a fair bit of money has been thrown at the issue. So it's not that the problem hasn't been identified, and it's not that steps haven't been taken to try and address it. But I think many of those steps that have been taken have been what I would call a deficit model approach, and it's often a model that's used in the context of disability, which is how can we skill women up so that they are able to take these opportunities or perform at the same level as their male counterparts. And of course, those kinds of approaches aren't necessarily always wrong, and they're not necessarily badly intended either. And a lot of women subscribe to them, and a lot of women promote those policies. The whole Lean In movement is about women leaning in further so that they get noticed and they participate. The challenge is, however, that's only going to get us so far, because it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of the space. What it does is it makes the group of people who are struggling to access the space on equal terms a bit better at accessing it. And so things like mentoring programs for women to build confidence, to build networks, are useful, but they're not going to solve the problem entirely. If we keep the assessment measures the same and the people making all the decisions pretty much unchallenged. And it's not just about the legal profession. I mean, I've recently completed with a colleague a study in the context of the legal academy in terms of women in law schools. And when you start looking at the figures there, they're not so different, to be honest, when you look at female seniority and women ending up in senior-ish but administrative handmaiden type roles, and men ending up in senior but more prestigious roles. It starts to make sense of things like gender pay gap statistics, which are often about all women and all men, as opposed to necessarily people at exactly the same levels of seniority. Because we see so few women at certain levels of seniority, we can't really do the comparator. So what would it look like to try and change the nature of the space? So some of the work that I do with some law firms is to go in and start actually looking at all the decision points and all the processes and saying, these may not look jarring to you, and this may be the way it has always been done, with a few technological bells and whistles added. But the thought processes are still pretty much the same. You know, why is this particular measure still being used as one of the key indicators for promotion? How does it help you measure performance? And what are the downsides? So it's trying to get people to move from what we call systems 1 thinking, which is sort of this equals that, to recognising system 2 thinking, which is we're using this to try and get us here, but there are a whole series of leaps that we've had to make to get from this proxy, this blunt measure, to try and make this assessment. And each of those assumptions has some positive things in it and also a whole heap of negative ones. And they differentially affect people. So the less part of a dominant group you are, the more you're disadvantaged, which is where the intersectionality obviously comes in. So being female may be one factor. Not being part of the dominant racial group in the firm, usually white British, is going to then put you at a further disadvantage. Being gay rather than straight, being disabled rather than able-bodied, all of those things are likely to add a layer of disadvantage. So it's challenging the thinking.
Thank you, Lisa. Further questions? We've got one at the front here.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'm a current student of the University of London Distance Learning. And this is a general question. I would like to ask you, if you think that nowadays a girl or a woman is more likely to be inspired to get to a high-level education through governments or non-governmental organizations or campaigns or the family.
Thank you.
And if this is an indication for the future, where are we going?
Okay,
Thank you.
So to the whole panel, to perhaps take it each in turn, who or what is most likely to inspire a girl or a woman? The government, governmental bodies, non-governmental bodies, or indeed the family? And how does it look for the future? Who wants to try that first?
I'll give that a go.
Go for it, Becca. Thank you.
So I feel like I'm giving a hedging answer of, surely we want all of them, but maybe I'm just being greedy here. I know as a campaigner we're often meant to pick our priorities and our battles and where our resources go, but the nature of, so from the Leading Women initiative that's been run here to things that mentoring that happens in schools, and not only for what will inspire girls, it's also about what is going to allow men and boys to feel comfortable with changing dynamics of power. Because I think there's a really interesting thing here which goes back to this deficit model thing that we often focus on. How do you feel inspired to get somewhere? And part of the inspiration, it seems to be, is about how much you're able to take. So we talk about having a thick skin. And I think that there's, you can't be sensitive to the fact that you're in an environment that feels hostile to you, but to walk into a slightly hostile environment every single day compared to one that's comfortable for others, the onus of inclusion is on everyone. So I think we have to change that dynamic. If it comes to what works, there are different programs out there that are obviously working in different levels, and I think it, again, comes back to country-specific, cultural norms, where do people get their inspiration from is a really interesting question. There's a huge argument at the moment that actually there is declining trust in institutions, and that the way that grassroots movements are working and the way that cultural movements are working, that actually they can be more influential than our traditional actors. But that might be a very particular view to the UK or maybe to Western politics. And I think it's something to be careful when we,
Rachel?
Sure. Well, I think that's quite a complicated question, and Becca's really articulated it quite nicely. As we would want all of it, but it's going to depend on various contexts. I know with myself, I have 2 daughters and a son, and it's really important to me that I go to work and continue going to work, which is much harder, I have found, than in South Africa, being here and working full-time and being a mother of 3. But it's important to me because the children, and particularly the girls, can see that women don't have to be confined to particular roles and can make decisions that affect the family, but can affect the family in a positive way. So, I mean, I recently moved here, our family recently moved here from South Africa, and it was because of a career choice of mine and not my husband's. And I think that was really important for the children to see that it can be the woman that leads the family and takes the family places. And I mean, that's just my personal belief, but I think family plays a really important role, and the community that you're in encouraging women and encouraging them to work, especially when they have children. I mean, in South Africa, where I lived before, I was able to work because I had the support of my in-laws and the community there who helped look after the children. It's a little bit different here. I mean, I have my mother who's wonderful, but it's not that sort of same broad community of people that make these things possible. So that's my sort of personal answer to your question.
Lisa?
So I think I'm going to have a slightly different take on the question, if I may. And I think it's who's most likely to stop opportunities for girls and women, as opposed to, in for example, this context. Because I think, we have got to a stage in many communities in Britain where it is at least feasible in many contexts for girls and women to enter education beyond school leaving age. The question is, what barriers are there for women's equal participation? And some of those will be financial, Some of those will be cultural. And some of those will be about the girls and women themselves saying, I'm not sure I can. And I think that's the challenge. It's what expectations are there for you, and how able are you, if those expectations are that you won't proceed on to university education and beyond, how able are you to actually be resilient and to somehow manage to overcome the odds. So in my case, when there was an expectation that I would go to university because my parents had been to university. If I'd chosen not to, that would have been fine. But I wasn't part of a generation that had to try and break the mould. It had been broken by the generation before me. That made it much easier for me. But that's not true of everybody, of course. There are still many people for whom higher education is something that they would love to do, but they don't have a role model within their family or community. Having said that, when I was at university as an undergraduate law student, I was taken to one side when I said I wanted to be a barrister and told it wasn't a good idea. And I was told it wasn't a good idea because at the time, and it was a good while ago now, but at the time, there were very few women at the bar. I'm short. I'm 5 foot. I always turn up to events like this so that I am better able to access the room and for other people to see me. I always turn up in heels. I don't wear them much of the time, but I turn up in heels so people can see me. I was told I looked very young, which I did, and I wouldn't be taken very seriously as a little girl. And I thought, well, do you know what? They're probably right. And it was only much later that I found the confidence to think, do you know, I probably could do that, having seen other people do it. So it's not always just about who will help, but it's who or what I think will stop you or damp down your expectations. That'll be very different for different people.
Thank you very much. More questions? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lee. I've just started a graduate diploma in economics here, distance learning, very exciting. I've got a question for the entire panel, including the chair lady. In terms of your own experience, what drove you? What drove you to be the best that you can?
Well, there's a question for us. Who's going to start? What drove us to be the best that we can? Go on there, Rachel.
Well, I think that's a really personal question. So without giving too much away, I once heard a study which talked about why certain children were successful in school and why others weren't. And I think it was a TED talk, and the woman was speaking about how the children that were successful had a certain amount of grit. They'd been through certain difficulties in life, and they had barriers that they wanted to push and overcome. And I think for me, I mean, I moved to South Africa in my early 20s and had a child very young in Western standards. And on the same day I found out that I was pregnant with my first child, I found out that I had got into a master's program at the University of Cape Town. And I think what drove me to succeed there was just this sense of, I can do it, F you all, I can have a baby and do a master's, and I continued from there. So then I fell pregnant with my son, and within that week that I had found out I was pregnant, I got my first job post-masters, and then my third child was born in the middle of my PhD studies, and she was 1 year old when I graduated. So for me, it was always about, well, I can do this, no one can say I can't, I can have 3 children, and I can have a career, and it was about fighting against the expectations of women to not be able to do more than just one thing.
Some of that definitely resonates. Basically, if someone tells me I can't do something, I kind of say, watch me. But I think there's other elements to it for me. Driving, there's 2 sides of it. One is the bit where people tell you can't do something, and then there's that support network that lifts you up, and there's the structures that allow you to do it. And I think there's one thing to have drive, and there's another thing to have opportunity. So I
I would class myself as a driven woman, an ambitious woman. I also work part-time, which means that most people assume that my drive and ambition is not quite there. But my body can offer me part-time, and it offers me that on a very, well, sparing scale at times. I think that when it comes to drive, it's been partly that attitude of, I can do this and I will show you. It's also been the WhatsApp groups when you've had, for the 4th time that week, someone ask you why it is you haven't gone to Dignitas, an assisted suicide clinic in Switzerland, because you have chronic pain, and surely you'd want to be dead rather than doing what you're doing. It's also the times that I've had help from the state, or haven't had help from the state, as it may be. So disability benefits are critical for me. It costs me extra to get around. So literal drive, I tend to use taxis. I've got a much higher cost of living, which is pretty typical. I think it's like £570 or something like that. It's typical per month for a disabled person, extra cost of living. So if I was going to say what's driven me, there is the people that have said no, and the moments that I've enjoyed showing it's possible. There's the people that have said yes and continue to, even today, when I was sent the letter asking to be part of the leading Women 150, I had to put the letter into a WhatsApp group and check that everyone thought it was okay. And I got a lot of comments back about being an idiot and that I should just go ahead and say yes. But there was still that small bit in my head that said, do I deserve this? Should I be here? Should I allow myself to be in that space? So having that has been critical, and building that support network and finding particular spaces. So Sisters of Frida Disabled Women's Network has been fantastic for me. There are groups that I have met through feminism, through campaigning, who have been critical for support. And then I've been very lucky with my family and friends who've also supported me. But there is also the structural element, and I do want to say that for all the drive that I had, there were points where drive was not enough, and the opportunities were not there, and that what I've had to do is go into places and ask them to change spaces. So I've had to pretend that I can do what is expected of someone who is not disabled, and then go in there and change it whilst I'm in there. So sometimes it's just turning up somewhere and going, you know what, this looks like a nice idea, but maybe we could try it this way. So that's been part of it.
So I can feel a theme emerging. So I suppose, why did I go the way I went? Firstly, because some people said it could not be done by me. And, you know, I suppose it was just what was the prevailing norm at the time, really. And this isn't about men telling women they can't do things. It's about people telling women they can't do things. And it was relatively unusual in Yorkshire in the 1970s for somebody to think that they might want an education. And whilst it was perfectly normal in my family, it was really very, very strange for most of the people I knew, for my friendship circle, and even to an extent for some of the people who were teaching me. It just seemed strange. I mean, one of the things that, you know, at secondary school I was taught typing, which I have to say has been one of the best things I was ever taught, but I was taught typing with an old-fashioned typewriter because it was a fallback position for girls if they couldn't get a job in the kind of work they wanted to become a secretary. So I was taught to type with one of those drop-down typewriters, and having been told this was what you could expect, I thought, stuff that for a game of soldiers. I don't see why I should have to, and I was very supported by my family, who also said, this is ridiculous, this is back in the dark ages. So part of it was about showing people, some people, I could do it. Part of it was also about other people saying, of course you can do it. And it's not just that you can do what you think you can do far more besides. And it was people opening doors and helping me through and helping me up. And many of those people were men, not just women. They were people who saw me and said, there's talent here. For goodness sake, don't compromise. And what's more, don't limit yourself to what you think you can do. Leap, and we'll make sure you're okay. So there was that as well. And so I think for many of us, it's that strange contradiction of wanting to show one group of people we can do it, and on the other hand, having others who don't only support but also raise our aspirations of what we're capable of. And that made an enormous difference to me, and still does. Still does.
I think there are such familiar themes in this, but in my case, I was born into a family. My mother was born at the beginning of the 20th century. My parents were. And my mother apparently desperately wanted to be an accountant. But young women, or girls, and then young women in West Glamorgan, South Wales, at that time, could not train to become accountants. And she never, ever forgot that. She did train to become a teacher, but the day she got married, she had to give up the job because married women could not be teachers or indeed nurses and several other professions as well. So that day, she had to give up being a teacher. And she never forgot that either. I had 2 older brothers, and I was always taught that I could do just what my brothers did, if not more, and I should, and I had to. And it was kind of my mission to live the life she wished, in some senses, she could have lived and experienced. And so my parents and my brothers encouraged me to do what I could do. And in a sense, that's lived with me since. And I still think of that woman born before she could have the vote, at a time when girls could not become accountants, and at a time when married women, the day they got married, had to give up being teachers. So I don't think we've got there yet, but I'm flying that flag. There was somebody at the front who wanted to ask a question. That's right.
Hello.
Probably the last one, but let's see.
Hello, my name is Edina. I would like to ask a question to Becca Bunce. In the campaigns that you are leading, because you already have much experience and know much about the interaction with people, I would like to ask you, how do you think that people interact and they respond to the campaigns that you lead? What are the perspectives and overall goals of your campaigns, and how are you going to achieve them?
So what are the perspectives, what are the goals of your campaigns, and how are you going to achieve them?
Okay, so...
Small challenge there.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to focus on IC change here, and then I'll do a little bit on Involve and where we're going. So with IC change, we're set up very specifically to get the ratification and implementation of the Istanbul Convention. We originally set up to just focus on ratification, but as we spoke to organisations in the women's sector, it was critical that we also reflected that implementation element. I think, as any campaign goes through, we've gone through different stages of public consciousness or not. In many ways, actually, as a brand, we're not particularly known, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. When we took the private members bill through last year, you might have heard about it because of an MP called Philip Davies, who tried to talk the bill out. And a lot of the focus at that point was around domestic violence. And that's because that was the bit that the media picked up. So as a campaign, we tend to try and talk about the wide range of violence, but it depends on what the media will pick up and what perspectives that they take on. So one of the things that we have to do is, as we go through each stage of the campaign, so we got that bill through, we're currently looking at the domestic abuse bill, but it's looking more widely at issues of extraterritorial jurisdiction. So the final bit is Article 40 that the government believes needs to be done for ratification of the Istanbul Convention in relation to substantive law, because you have to they prefer to have domestic laws put in place before they ratify, is that they have to apply the extraterritorial jurisdiction to offences such as rape, domestic violence. I think so-called gender-based violence has already got it applied, but there are forced abortion, forced sterilisation, so there's certain key offences, and that was recently consulted on as part of the domestic abuse bill. And what will be coming up next will be us talking about how that's going through in the next stages with that. So in some ways with a campaign, I think the key bit is remembering that we, at different stages, are reaching different audiences. And it's really important that we reach the right audience at the right time to get the right pressure to make something happen. So when the bill was going through, we needed a really wide media base. And we were very, very lucky that Emma Watson supported the campaign, that we got in wider building in terms of different political parties actually really got on board. And I've got to say the generosity across all of the parties actually, particularly from their women's sections, was incredible in opening up that access. But as we've moved through to the domestic abuse consultation, we've actually been quite quiet as a campaign, because one of the key things is that we don't want to be telling people to do something that they don't need to be doing. It's critical that we communicate with people what they can do, but we don't tell you that you can do something when there isn't something there isn't anything to be done. So you will be hearing from us. Look out for stuff probably September, October times. It depends when the government puts out its version of the bill, but yeah, keep an eye out. And if you do want to keep an eye out, you can sign up to the petition. You'll get an alert when we're going through to the next stage there. So that's one of the ways that people hear from us and one of the perspectives. When it comes to Involve is an organisation that looks at putting participation at the heart of decision making. And I think putting people at the heart of decision making is critical for making better decisions. And we've talked a lot about this today. There's a whole gap between representation and participation. There's something that we need to pass there. I've been brought in alongside my colleague Andreas to specifically look at how we can look at wider systems change. So one of the more interesting things that we did recently was a citizens' assembly on social care. It's the first time that Parliament has commissioned this type of public involvement. So it involves a representative sample of the English population, because it's looking at social care within England, and it was looking specifically at funding. And the results of that will be coming out when the parliamentary committees report on that in due course. It's a slightly different way of accomplishing your goals. In many ways, actually, who we're talking to there are the decision makers themselves, or the people that influence them. So in terms of perspectives and who we reach, the people that we reach will be different for different spaces. When it comes to disability and access, I'm often talking to NGOs now, so I tend to go in and do workshops with them about how they can change what they're doing. Sometimes you're working insider, sometimes with IC Change we've done real outsider, big noise, big media. And I think the key thing is that whatever we're doing, when it comes to talking about a campaign and when you're trying to influence, is that if you're saying something inside a room, don't go outside the room and say something completely different. Being consistent with what you're saying to the people in the room and acknowledging as much as you can with what they are doing outside of the room can go a long way to building trust between organisations and institutions that need to create change. So hopefully, does that answer the question? I think so.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that, Becca. And I'm afraid it's really come to the end of time for questions, but there'll be time over the reception to ask more and to discuss more, and for you to discuss among yourselves. So I'd like to thank you for finding time and taking time out of your evening to come and join us. But I'd particularly, and I'm sure you would wish to join me, in thanking the speakers for speaking to us so personally, so engagingly, and interestingly, but above all, I think, inspirationally. So a huge thank you to Becca. To Lisa. And last but not least, to Rachel. I'm sure you'll all agree with me, it's been a huge privilege. Thank you all very, very much. There will now be a drinks reception in the lobby and an opportunity to mingle with representatives from the University of London. So please join us just outside. Thank you. Fantastic.